Hello, everyone. Welcome to tonight's virtual panel discussion focused on how incarceration affects our young people. This is the second in a series of 8 virtual panel discussions hosted by Nebraskans for Prison Reform and Stand In for Nebraska. These panels are scheduled to occur bi-weekly between now and mid-October, and the series will focus on a variety of topics related to mass incarceration and prison reform, including rehabilitation, reentry, restorative justice, and others. We hope that you will join us for all of our future conversations. My name is Dr. Brashani Reese, and I'm a public speaker for ending life sentencing and advocate for restorative justice practices, and I am your facilitator for this evening's discussion. A few logistics. As an attendee, your sound and your video is automatically muted upon entry, but feel free to utilize the chat window and the Q&A feature, which you can find at the bottom of your screen for any questions that you may have. And if you're experiencing any technical difficulties, please private message our Zoom host, Ashley, from Nebraskans for Prison Reform. You may have noticed that tonight's conversation is streaming on Facebook, and it is also being recorded, so it will be available for future viewing. Without further ado, allow me to introduce you to our esteemed panelists. With us tonight, we have Senator Terrell McKinney. Senator McKinney was elected to the Nebraska legislature in 2020 and represents the 11th district, a seat which was formerly held by Nebraska's longest serving Senator Ernie Chambers. We have Dr. Mark Foxall, who is the former director of the Douglas County Department of Corrections, a position that he held from 2011 until he retired in 2018. Prior to this, he was a police officer with the Omaha Police Department and a special agent with the FBI. The recipient of several recognition awards, he is now a community service associate with the School of Criminology and Criminal Justice at the University of Nebraska, Omaha. Each of our panelists will speak for about 10 to 15 minutes, and we are going to close our conversation tonight with a Q&A session. So feel free to drop your questions using the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. We are going to be tracking your questions as we go along and facilitating a Q&A at the end. So now I will turn the mic over to our first panelist, Senator McKinney. The floor is yours.
How everybody doing tonight? Again, I am Senator Terrell McKinney. I represent District 11, which is primarily North Omaha. And I decided to get on this panel because, juvenile justice was important to me prior to coming to office, especially thinking about, the individuals that are in the Douglas County Youth Correctional Center. On a given day, there's probably about 70 to 80% of the population comes from my community. And I think it's important that, we do all that we can as advocates, as leaders, or whatever we want to call ourselves, to always speak up for those individuals, because there are sometimes they feel like they don't have a voice, or their parents feel like they don't have a voice, and, how they're navigating through the system. As in my role as a state senator, I'm always looking across the country, looking at different research and things that come across my desk to see what can we do to, fix the juvenile justice system, because as we all know, it's not broken, it's built how it's supposed to operate, but how it's operating isn't right in so many ways. We got kids that are being displaced across the country that come from our community. We have a new juvenile justice center being built in downtown Omaha, but those same resources that went into that, juvenile justice center are not directed to the communities where these kids come from. And I think we need to do more preventative work on the front end to decrease the likelihood that these kids, because they are kids, don't end up in the system. Make sure their families are living under the poverty line. Make sure, they're getting, mental health treatment and trauma counseling and things like that. Making sure that, we stay on top of them. So if they do end up with an F or something, somebody stepping in to ensure that they don't fall through the cracks. Because what I found is there are so many people that know a lot of the kids that we see ending up on the news or ending up in these institutions. A lot of people, a lot of adults, a lot of people in important places have known these kids are, at risk to offend or end up in the system. But in my opinion, there's not a lot of things in place to prevent that. And I really don't understand why that is. And it's been that way, not now, but since I was a kid. We look at the kids who were involved in the shooting at Westroads. And I heard comments like, oh, I taught this kid in the past or something like that. And I knew he was probably going to end up like this. But it's like, okay, if you knew this 3 years ago, how do we allow this to happen? We're failing our kids as a society, in my opinion. And it's not just through policy. We have to do more community work. We also have to have more front end resources because that shouldn't be happening. My district has had an uptick in shootings from youth and things like that. And a lot of people come to me and say, hey, let's have a peace rally. Let's call a truce. All, in my opinion, those things are not realistic because you're not looking at the full story. There's been peace rallies, there's been people calling truces and things like that. But until we get resources to the families that these kids are coming from, we're going to continue to have this cycle. I come from that. My whole family, both sides, were involved in the streets and gangs, so I know it firsthand. And a lot of times the reasons that the people I grew up with and the kids I talk to end up in the streets or even venturing down that road is because they lack resources. They grow up in environments that are not the best. And I had somebody ask me like, why is that? How's that so? And I was like, just imagine if you grew up in a family of lawyers, everybody in your family became a lawyer, went to law school, became a lawyer in practice. The likelihood of you becoming a lawyer is high. But you got to think about these kids. They're growing up in environments where, one, they're poor, and two, most of the people in their families are in the streets or have been in the streets. So what is the likelihood of them ending up in the streets if we don't do things as leaders to ensure that we provide them the resources that they need to be successful? And that's something that's always going to stick with me because I know those kids, and that could have easily been me. I coach, wrestling in the community with the youth club, Ready RP Nationals. We have about probably on a good year, 50 to 60 kids, and they all come from different environments. And I try to tell people that if you really want to see where we at as a society, sit in a room full of kids. They'll tell you the truth and they'll ask you questions that you wouldn't even imagine. And I think we all should do that as whatever, if we want to call ourselves leaders. I just look at myself as a member of the community, but it's something we all should do. And I'll continue to continue to advocate for kids here in Lincoln. This year I didn't introduce any bills that necessarily pertain to juvenile justice or prisons, but I supported some. But going forward, I'll definitely be introducing bills to address the juvenile justice system and the criminal justice system, period, because it needs to be fixed. It's working how it was designed to work, and we have to do all we can to fix it. I'm not gonna say it's okay and Nebraska's not the worst or whatever. It's bad across the board, not only in Nebraska, but across the country. And we have to do better as a society. We cannot give up on people because they end up in the system. We have to do all that we can to make sure that we could get them out the system and they can end up as successful individuals. I spent my whole afternoon at the Nebraska State Penitentiary, and I saw people in there that I knew my whole life, and a lot of them were in the juvenile justice system. So it's obviously, doing its job. If, they ended up in the juvenile justice system, and then they're transitioning to the state penitentiary system. And that's sad. And, I'm finished. Thank you for having me tonight.
Since you was in the NSP, I would like to add the Nebraska State Penitentiary. Do you feel some of them, that's the male prison, so some of the brothers in there that have grown up in there and matured and educated themselves, do you feel, and with that question, how do you feel, if you feel yes, they can contribute to juveniles changing their course, you know, juveniles having maybe a mentor, that's somebody that's been all the way through this thing and comes back around?
I believe so. I was talking to an individual, I can't remember his name off the top of my head, but he said he went in when he was young and probably been in about 20 years, but now he's one of the advocates on the unit, you know what I mean? Trying to make sure everybody is okay and, you know, speaking up for people. So yes, I think, you know, they definitely, you know, he was like, I know I did what I did in the past, but I was a kid then and I've grown. I believe I changed myself. And it's a lot of people like that. Even when I went to Tecumseh, it was a man, I think he might have been 70 years old, been in prison probably 40 plus years. And he's like, am I not rehabilitated? Like, I'm doing everything they tell me to do, but I still can't be released. And we got a lot of people like that I think they could be very helpful to our juveniles in the community and those that do end up in the system to talk to and have mentors to guide them through and get them on the right track.
Thanks. That was really interesting. Do you have any idea what kind of legislation we should be looking at? Obviously, as a group, we tend to support senators in their efforts, or, you know, if there's something you think that we and the public could be doing between now and the next session to kind of focus in on things like youth incarceration and the other topics that we're doing as well.
One thing that came up a bunch while I was at NSP was a lot of individuals that went in as juveniles that, you know, felt like they were over sentenced or, you know, they should be given some type of sentence reduction. We should definitely.
Syncing it up.
Patty, could you show me how to get the volume up on this thing?
Hey, Tom. But
Tom, Ashley, you can, okay, got it, Tom. Thank you.
something like that. I was also, you know, looking at how we do day service and things like that.
Okay, there. And how do I hear?
It's a lot of stuff, honestly, that we definitely should put on the table and see what works best.
We have a Facebook question, so I just want to ask this from Samuel. What are your thoughts on transitional living for youth aging 18 to 21?
I think it needs to be better. I think, you know, I used to hate when people would say, oh, you're my kid, but when you turn 18, I'm gonna throw you to the streets or you got to figure out on your own. I remember being 18 and I didn't have the knowledge that I have now. Luckily, you know, my mom was there to stay in my life, to guide me, but we can't just throw our kids into the streets because they age out the system. We have to make sure they still have resources to grow and be productive members of our communities. But if we just throwing them to the streets and saying survive, when we've given them no tools, especially kids that grow up in District 11, which has, as we know, the highest poverty rate, and most of these kids are growing up poor. So how are we going to throw them to the streets, then be mad that they're in the streets? It don't make sense.
I do apologize sincerely, Senator McKinney. Lightning literally just struck and took out my internet. So I apologize for missing what you had to say. I look forward to hearing more from you as we move into a Q&A. I did want to interject really quickly and introduce Attorney Tom Riley, who is just joining us now. Attorney Riley has been the Douglas County Public Defender in Nebraska since 1996. He fights for common sense reform in the Nebraska justice system through his involvement in various committees and groups. So I just wanted to introduce you really quickly. Attorney Riley, we will get to you after we move on to our next speaker, Dr. Mark Foxall. Dr. Foxall, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much, and good afternoon, everyone. Mr. Riley, been a little bit, sir. Good to see you. Ladies and gentlemen, my career started about 41 years ago in the in law enforcement, criminal justice world. I started out as an Omaha police officer as I was introduced. So I bring a unique perspective to the discussion today. My family's been involved in law enforcement for a long time, going back to 1938 in the Omaha area. So we have unfortunately seen successive generations of same family members pass through the criminal justice system. So when people talk to me, well, does jail work, does punishment work? And I'm thinking, well, does it make you feel good? Because that's about all it's doing for you. Because you see people coming back through, see families in despair, and if my family's put a lot of people in jail, and we'd have solved crime a long time ago. And clearly, the monolithic approach to addressing needs that cause people to run afoul of the law just has not worked. And we're long since past the time of trying to change how we approach this issue of criminal victimization. Senator McKinney said something at the beginning of his presentation that I thought was very thoughtful, in that you can't just look to a warehouse and try to figure out how to help people. You've got to be on the prevention side of this. And we all too often wait until someone's in trouble, dire straits, mentally ill, 4 or 5, 6, 7 cases stacked up on them. Family is dysfunctional, neighborhood socially disorganized, and then, okay, now we're going to let you have it and put you in jail for X amount of time. And that cycle begins early in the juvenile justice system and then carries on into the adult system. There's almost 2.1, 2.3 million people locked up. 44,000 of those are kids. And are there some people that need to be incarcerated? Yeah, some people need to be incarcerated, but that's not most people. That's not everybody, and that gets lost on people because we get these little sound bites through print and broadcast media that we need to be tough on crime. What you need to be is vigilant on addressing the issues that cause people to steal, use drugs, commit other types of person crime or property crime, but all too often the money goes into the back end of the system. We need to hire more police. We need to hire more prosecutors. We need to build more jails. We need to continue to clamp down on crime and injustice. And we don't think much about how things came to be as they are. Now, that's a little bit of a history lesson. They told me that I only have 10 or 15 minutes. I need about 2 or 3 years to break down how our situation came to be as it is. I in the twilight of my career, I ran the Douglas County Department of Corrections, a 1,452 bed adult facility holding pretrial, low-end offenders, low-risk offenders, all the way to maximum custody offenders. And one of the things I like to do is talk to those individuals as I walk through the housing units and ask them about their situations and how things came to pass for them. And you look at some of their history insofar as their contacts with law enforcement are concerned, and you can see things starting at a very early age for those individuals. 10 or 15 years old. You see abuse in their family. You see neglect on their record. Then you see them missing or running away. And then you see drug possession charges. And then you see assault as a victim. And then then you begin to see property crime, theft by unlawful taking, theft by receiving, and then it graduates up maybe to misdemeanor assault, then felony assault, and then it just compounds and just starts rolling. And Mr. Riley can certainly attest to that, because Mr. Riley and I had some long conversations about this and how to interdict offending and victimization in our community. And we've both been quite frustrated. And Tom, I'll let you speak for yourself, but we've both been frustrated at the pace of reform, and not just our community. And I just want to beat up on Omaha and Douglas County in the state of Nebraska, but across the country. And there's just not been a higher priority placed on trying to address the needs of our community so that we don't have to concentrate law enforcement resources to the extent that mass incarceration becomes a result of what was maybe well-intended to begin with, but ultimately had a very disproportionate impact on communities of color. So when I was asked to speak today about reform in the juvenile justice system, I said, I'd rather speak about how do we reform a system that leads to people coming into jail in the first place. And a couple of weeks ago, I did a presentation on that involved a conversation about ACEs scores, adverse childhood experiences. And you know what? I got to be careful because I can go on forever. But how many more minutes do I have, maybe?
It's not that strict. Don't worry about it. You just
Okay.
carry on.
As I teach a 3-hour class, and to my graduate students, I'm just getting warmed up. So, but I promise I won't do 3 hours. But I talked about adverse childhood experiences, and folks, that's where a lot of it really begins. What are those adverse childhood experiences, and what's the trauma that some of those individuals experience that led them to a life of crime, life of victimization too. So I don't talk about offending in and of itself. I talk about offending and victimization because the two go hand in hand. But you have to look at those adverse childhood experiences, and you look at who's disproportionately impacted by those adverse childhood experiences. And I'll tell you that young African Americans, young Latino men and women are adversely impacted by those childhood experiences that result in trouble and have really long-lasting effects in life, and really impacts how they behavior in the community, behavior in school. And I saw a question earlier today about the school to prison pipeline, and thinking, okay, if we look at what has occurred in that young boy or girl's life, and it has caused or manifested some of the behavior inside that classroom. Well, I think you have to look at some of those experiences, and you look at the trauma, and you look at those ACEs scores and how high they are, particularly for people of color, and what some of the long-term effects are. Is it within our ability to address all of these needs? No, but it's really nice to have someone like Senator McKinney on the panel here, because he knows from the work that he does in the legislature, from some of what he's seen in the community, that there is a different approach to trying to address some of these problems, as opposed to just hiring more police officers, toughening up the laws, enhancing some of the penalties of the laws, and then trying to lock more people up at what has historically been an alarming rate for juveniles and adults. Some of those commonplace traumatic experiences that I saw when I talked to some of the inhabitants of my correctional facility: emotional abuse, physical abuse, sexual abuse, neglect, separation, divorce, seeing violence at a very early age. And folks, that sticks with you for a long time. I asked a group of 40 people, I said, how many of you have kids? Almost 95% of the hands went up. How many of your kids seen somebody shot? Nobody's hand. Stabbed? Nobody's hand. Okay, drug out of a car and beat up? Nobody's hand went up. So in some of our communities, not just here in Omaha, some of our kids have seen that and more. There's no surprise that some of the kids in some of the communities that are beset by violence have some really a difficult time in school, in community, and in certain social settings. But then what do? Well, we're going to lock you up. I'm going to teach you a lesson. Okay, tell me how that's worked for you. So, folks, I'm very passionate about this. I could go on for a long time, but in deference to my esteemed colleagues, I want to certainly leave time for them to speak too, but also open up the door to answer a lot of questions. And like I said, 41 years of experience in policing, federal law enforcement, local law enforcement, corrections, and now academia. I've seen quite a bit, and I'm just frustrated that we haven't moved the needle as much to put me out of work or put Mr. Riley out of a job.
Thank you so much, Dr. Foxall. I look forward to a really robust Q&A. We have a lot of questions coming in, and so now I'd like to turn the mic over to Attorney Riley so that we can hear from him, and then we'll jump into our Q&A session. Attorney Riley, the floor is yours.
Hello. I've been listening to, first of all, I'm sorry, my technological skills are a little bit diminished, so I was a little late getting on because I couldn't figure it out. But that said, I heard what Senator McKinney and Mark Foxall said. I don't know Senator McKinney that well. I'm becoming more familiar with him over the last year or so. I've known Dr. Foxall for quite some time. And one of the amazing things is that a lot of folks would think that the public defender and, the police officer slash FBI agent slash director of corrections would be on opposite sides of the fence. And what turns out is that on many of the issues that we're discussing, we're on exactly the same page. What becomes most frustrating is that they don't listen to us. The people who have the power to make changes don't listen to Mark, don't listen to me, don't listen to Senator McKinney, don't listen to Ashley, don't listen to Shakur. But that doesn't mean we should stop talking. It's frustrating, it's difficult, but to me, it's worth all the effort. What I've seen over the last, I've been in the public defender's office since 1975, and I've seen a lot of, I guess, roller coasters back and forth. Once in a while we'll make some progressive changes and things will look good, and all of a sudden, because of politics, it changes and it goes the other way. I'm quite frustrated with the way things are going right now with the sentencing issues, especially with, I know, things that are very close to the heart of Ashley and Shakur and Mark and Terrell about / mental illness and / juveniles treated as adults. Just like Mark said, I could probably talk for 2 or 3 hours about some of this stuff because it's so, there's so many points that we have to make that people, it seems to be falling on deaf ears. But I guess my point is that, I've been on committees ad infinitum, ad nauseum, actually. And Terrell, you're on this committee with me on supposedly going to be criminal justice reform and prison reform and stuff. I hope something happens, but I'm not optimistic. I don't mean to be a wet blanket, but it's very disconcerting because I've been down this road before. I've heard national organizations talk about what the problems are. And they talk about get rid of mandatory minimum, change the way you do good time and parole eligibility, things like that. And everyone seems to agree on it except the politicians. And, at some point in time, you'd like to think maybe the courts would intercede and do what they're supposed to do. But in Nebraska, as long as the politicians keep appointing the judges, it becomes a difficult process. The one optimistic thing I can say is, and maybe this is minuscule, but I've been trying to push for reform on the felony murder rule. And I've seen some really interesting progressive movements in states that you would figure that they would be, but they're logical. Talking about situations where legislators have said, if you got convicted of a felony murder offense, first-degree murder, and got a life sentence, and you are not the actual person who committed the shooting or the stabbing or the homicidal act, maybe you should get resentenced instead of having an automatic life sentence. And I think that there may be some hope that things like that could have some play in the legislative sessions coming up. I don't know, Shakur, I know you're pretty active in talking to a lot of the senators, and of course, Senator McKinney, you are as well. But those are the kind of things that maybe we can do some baby steps to try to get some progressive movement. And, you know, I know on a personal level, Ashley, I've spoken with her and talked with her about the pardons board, or the whatever they want to call it. And it's so frustrating that it's just an automatic no, it seems. They don't want to listen to what should be said and heard. They don't want to hear about it. And they're all either so far locked in on their views, or they don't want to listen to what's being said. It's so frustrating. So I'll just pass it on to people that are smarter than me. I'll never give up, but I am frustrated.
Attorney Riley, thank you so much for speaking up. You brought so much more to the table. We've expanded this conversation beyond the impact of incarceration on our youth, talking about felony murder, the frustrations in the system, the political appointments of the judges, and how do we actually enact real change, long-lasting change in our country. So thank you. I just wanted to take a quick second to introduce our fourth, last but not least, panelist who just joined us, Shakur Abdullah from the Community Justice Center. Shakur was sentenced to life imprisonment as a juvenile, and so he is a former lifer. He was released through commutation, and he has worked to improve the justice system in Nebraska. And Shakur, I'd love to turn the mic over to you to speak. You have about 10 or 15 minutes, and then we are going to jump into a Q&A session. Welcome.
Thanks for having me. Sorry for being late, but you know, life interrupts everything. So let me just kind of start with an overview of the Nebraska system. So I went to prison at 17 years old. I ultimately ended up with a life sentence, but my sentence originally started on death row at 17 years old. That was at one point, a couple years after my arrival, commuted to life, thanks to a series of Supreme Court decisions. I'm sure that has probably been mentioned already. I was able to get resentenced, and that resentence ended 41-year stay in the Nebraska Department of Corrections. So, you know, my subject matter expertise comes from that whole experience. And I would be remiss, you know, if I didn't say up front that, you know, the things sent me to prison were horrible offenses, offenses that needed to be addressed. You know, so I always am culpable and responsible and accountable for those horrible acts that I will forever have to attempt to make amends for. Part of that is just making sure that I never repeat the offenses that sent me there. And I think that is something that is overlooked with children. If you look at the UNCRC, the United Nations Convention on the Rights of a Child, all of the nations that are part of the United Nations, except one, has signed off on that. It binds them to certain international laws, certain international agreements. If nobody has guessed which nation has not signed off, it is the United States. There is a provision in that convention that protects children under the age of 18. Those series of Supreme Court decisions starting in 2005 with Roper versus Simmons, a juvenile death penalty case out of Missouri, kind of set the bar for all of the other subsequent cases leading up to Miller versus Alabama, which made it possible for at least 27 individuals here in the state of Nebraska to get resentenced. I think that has happened for all but one. But that convention is important because if all of the other nations in the world, some that many people would consider so-called third world, so-called barbaric, if they have signed on to this agreement to make sure that children under 18 are not mistreated. And one of those provisions goes to juvenile life without parole sentences. The United States is the only country that still sentences children to that endless sentence, a sentence that some call death by incarceration, death through attrition. It is really a disproportionate sentence as it is applied to children when we just stop to think about all of the other ways that the society attempts to protect children with all of these age-restricted activities, whether it be smoking, voting, holding a political office, all of these other things, except when, unfortunately, some great harm has been committed. Then the society seems to be schizophrenic in the sense that they just forget about all of those things and say, well, we are going to sentence you as an adult, as though that waves some magic wand and emancipate you. I can certainly testify to the fact that it does not. Even a child sentenced as a adult going into the adult system, all of those age restrictions still apply. So it seems to be just, feel good legislation that we are being tough on crime. But, the reality is it probably does a greater disservice to children to treat them in a manner that that they have not mentally developed enough faculties to be held accountable for. So just to kind of wrap this up and give some quick numbers, Miller versus Alabama is the United States Supreme Court decision that has allowed numerous former juvenile lifers, myself included, to be resentenced. Now, a lot of times there's this boogeyman attempt to scare the public. Well, we don't want these dangerous individuals out in society. Well, since Miller, 2012, there have been at least 750 plus individuals such as myself, former lifers, former juvenile lifers that have been released pretty much without incident. We have grown up, matured, become responsible, have held ourselves accountable, and have been held accountable by the sentences that we have gotten, many of them even much more lengthier than the one that I served. But we are not going back, we are not recidivating like many people would assume that we do. Like I say, we have grown up, matured, taken responsibility for our actions and grown up. Before Miller, one of the effects of that life without parole for juveniles is that before Miller, 61% of juvenile lifers were African-American or Hispanic. Those numbers since Miller has gone up. So since 2012 or prior to 2012, it was right at about like 61%. Since 2012, it has gone up to about 70%. So, these are disproportionate impacts of how I heard Tom talking a little bit about his frustration with the system. It is the disproportionate application of many of these laws that just make the system unfair, unjust, and has a greater impact on many people that are, considered marginalized and not really viable in the society. To date, there are 31 states in the United States that has either banned completely the use of the life without parole for juveniles, or simply have no one or don't use that sentence in their state. So, there has been some marginal gain since Miller, but in my mind, certainly not enough. And I think that there just needs to be a greater level of advocacy to make sure that children are treated as children. Look, many of the offenses and harms committed by children are horrible. Mine was. But the fact that we are children, I think, has to always be kept in mind and not be considered a throwaway. Consider somebody at 15, 16, 17 years old being looked at, judged through the lens of what could easily be termed the worst day of their life. And, people grow up, they change. And I think children, more so than anybody else, has to be afforded that opportunity. So with that, I will conclude. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Shakur. I think it's a really great moment to interject before we move into the Q&A to mention that one of the reasons why, according to psychological research, that children have been held to this extreme standard is the myth of the super predator, that even though that myth has been debunked almost as quickly as it sort of came about, it's been debunked for some time. But in 2013, a study was done that concluded that actually the majority of Americans believe in harsher punishing the younger a person is, which I think is really relevant for this conversation. Thank you. As we move into our Q&A, I'd love to turn the floor over to Ashley to start our first question.
My question was, I've spoken previously to you, Tom, about the increase in sentences over time in Nebraska, and I was wondering if you could just cover that briefly to show how it wasn't always like this, and what's kind of led to the incredible overcrowding that we're experiencing with people having the longer sentences, etc.
Thanks, Ashley. Yes, we have talked about this before, and I know I've had this discussion with Shakur and some of the organizations that you all are involved in, and we are all involved in. The truth of the matter is that probably I started in 75, and children who committed offenses, now children at that time was under 18, committed even serious offenses, most of the time were treated in juvenile court unless it was a homicide. I'm talking about sexual assault, I'm talking about robberies, armed robberies and things like that. Even though they were allegedly violent offenses, most frequently, if they were 16, 17 years old, they went to juvenile court. As time moved on into the 80s and the 90s with the get tough on crime politics stuff, the sentencing became harsher. They increased the penalties. They started introducing mandatory minimums. They became much less, and I'm talking about they meaning prosecutors and judges, became much less willing to transfer cases to the juvenile court system and treated, as Shakur said, children as adults. And in those days, they didn't have quite the scientific information that is so overwhelming now, that the brain development doesn't complete itself on the executive function until probably the mid-20s. And unfortunately, if you were treated as an adult in adult court, even if you were 14 or 15 or 16 years old, they were giving you adult penalties. And there have been so many statutory changes that I won't get into because they're nuanced, but the bottom line is there are so many people that are under 22 or 23 years old that are doing 40, 50, 60, 70, 80, 90-year sentences in prison now. In many respects, and maybe Mark can talk to this a little bit, in some respects, the jails have become mental health hospitals and, old age homes. Because judges who on the spur of the moment look at, oh, how horrible the crime is, and don't look at, the other nuanced information that is important about an individualized sentence, just say, well, the easy way to go is give you, instead of, 20 to 30, where you might have a chance of getting parole, they'll give you 60 to 80, where honestly, what I think a lot of the judges are doing, and especially on these kids, they're saying, I'm going to give you a sentence that's going to make you stay in prison at least till you're 65 years old, because then I know you won't commit any more crimes. And that is sickening. And I'll turn it over to some of my colleagues who would probably say the same thing, I think.
Thank you, Attorney Riley. I would actually love to get Dr. Foxall's thoughts on your specific comment around our prisons being mental health institutions and elderly, facilities for old people, essentially. Dr. Foxall?
Yeah, Mr. Riley's right. To my jail, before I retired, we were running an average daily population of approximately 1,250. And somewhere in the neighborhood of 65% of those individuals had some type of mental health diagnosis, whether it was from the low end of anxiety disorder, PTSD, all the way up to bipolar, schizophrenia, schizoaffective. And of that population of individuals who had some type of mental health diagnosis, 36% were seriously mentally ill. Now, remember, I told you I started in the business in law enforcement 41 years ago, and there just wasn't that. You didn't see those type of numbers. Number one, that many people are incarcerated. Number two, that many people with some type of mental health diagnosis. And the resources that are available in the community now to assist people that are experiencing some type of mental health crisis are just certainly not adequate to meet the need. And if you think about inadequate to meet the need, that problem is certainly exacerbated in the disenfranchised communities. You don't have a healthcare provider, and in some people, the healthcare provider is a correctional facility. And how sad is that? Or your dental provider or your healthcare provider is a jail, and it shouldn't be like that. So it's back to my earlier discussion, where you have to provide the resources in the community before it gets to the point where you're forced into a situation of trying to incarcerate somebody to interdict the behavior. And that shouldn't be the end all be all. I ran a jail, so the population in a jail was moving, turning over quite frequently. We're booking maybe 20,000 people a year. I tell people that in other parts of the country, some of my colleagues run jails in Miami or New York or someplace. I said, you're booking 20,000 people in little old Omaha, Nebraska? Yeah, it's pretty punitive here in the community. We book 1,400 people a month, release 1,500 people a month. And that just doesn't speak well for the community, for a very wealthy community, I might add. So quite a number, about 45% of the people came through my facility that were going down to the DLC came out of my jail. Okay, so and you talk about the aging of a population. When you put on those penalty enhancements that Tom's talking about, you hit those people up for life, and you extend their sentence, or they're not eligible or can't get out on parole, then the age of your incarcerated population in a prison environment, not so much a jail, begins to grow over time. So your ADP goes up, your average daily population goes up, and your LOS goes up, and that's your average length of stay, because your population is getting older, or as in my case in the jail, my ADP went up, and the average length of my average daily population went up, and the average length of stay went up, because I was dealing with so many mentally ill people. And people would tell me, well, Dr. Foxall, he has schizophrenia. Jail's a safe place for the mentally ill. No, it's not. Okay. And I'd be happy to walk you through the facility. I think we tried to maintain a safe environment, but if you have a mental illness, why should you have to go to jail to access services? It's like sending you to jail so you can get your, some type of medical ailment resolved. And you shouldn't have to access jail or prison to get adequate close to adequate mental health services or physical services. So we're chasing the wrong dog again. And we're trying to put all the money into the back end of the system when we allow people to get in trouble, experience trauma, become incarcerated before we want to do anything about it. And it builds on itself. And we just continue to, if you're not going to change the laws, okay, and if you're going to continue to be more conservative, and if you're going to continue to beat that drum of a moral panic, and by God, if we don't deal with this offender, the community is going to be overtaken, then you better build some more prisons and jails. And nobody wants to do that. Well, some people don't want to do that. Okay. And I get that piece of it, but you can't have it both ways. Okay. You've got to put money on the front end of the system. Just have to. And mental health is a huge, huge issue. Law enforcement will tell you that. Courts will tell you that. Corrections will tell you that. But we still, and we're moving incrementally to making some type of change. But it's slow. It's so slow. Look how fast our country ultimately, when they got going on the pandemic, look how fast they moved. And we're still poking around dealing with issues relative to mental illness. Well, who's getting their services from the jail and law enforcement, who's not?
Very well said. Thank you so much, Dr. Foxall. I'd love to take a question now from one of our attendees and toss it to Senator McKinney, because it's kind of going on that trajectory of the larger picture. So one of our attendees, Roscoe, said, Senator, I met you at the Bryant Center event. I want to know your thoughts on how we can begin a process of healing in North Omaha from years of trauma and begin assisting families in poverty through employment and building up the community.
That's a complex question, but honestly, in my opinion, I think to address trauma and mental health issues, I think we got to start providing people the services that they need. But we also have to make going to see a counselor and getting mental health, treatment and things like that less taboo. Make it okay to say, go talk to somebody about your issues instead of saying, hold it in, be tough, suck it up, boys don't cry, and things like that. Because I think a lot of people deal with issues, and if you have no alternatives to channel your energy, it's being channeled in the streets, and a lot of times. But I think, we have to, it's my job, it's on me to be an advocate for the community, to try to get some more resources in North Omaha, because we could talk about a lot of this social stuff that could change, and it probably will change, but until we start lifting people out of poverty and give them some air to breathe and stop surviving and start living, it's going to be hard to address trauma and mental health, because why am I going to think about going to see a counselor when I need to work these 2 minimum wage jobs to stay afloat? It makes it's hard to deal with your kid if you're working 2 jobs that don't pay nothing. It's hard to even think about it. So it's complex, but it's not. To us, everybody on this panel, is probably simple: provide people resources on the front end and do the things that are needed. But we also got to change minds in public office. We got to somehow get across to my conservative colleagues and others that are still on the fence. And just, I keep pushing them. When I'm in the room with the governor, I bring it up every time. I'm like, you want to build this prison because there's an issue with overcrowding, but what would help or, decrease the overcrowding problem is if you put money into the place where these people are coming from and prevent it at the front end completely. If a kid ain't growing up poor, he's probably not gonna end up in a pen. But if you don't put, as the governor, if you don't put no money into that community, continue to neglect it, and the poverty rate is still what it is, and there hasn't been no change in so long, yes, you don't need another prison because you're not doing your job as an elected official to put the resources where it's most needed. And so, we got to press people, hold people accountable, and keep pushing. We got to do the work. I try to get out in the community as much as possible and still engage with people as much as I can, go to different community meetings and things like that. But I think it's on all of us. We can't sit on Facebook and behind a computer screen. We got to reach the people and get into the streets to figure out what's going on. How can I help them? But from my perspective, it's me being an advocate as a senator to try to get bills passed that provides more resources to lessen the burden of living through poverty so we can start talking about mental health and trauma. But if they're still, from my experience, it's hard to convince somebody that's living in poverty to listen to you because they're thinking about how am I going to pay the bills and how I'm going to eat the next day.
Exactly. Thank you. Very well said. On Maslow's hierarchy of needs, right? Our first stuff, food, safety, security. Anybody who can tend to mental health, most of the time we're operating on a higher level and we've had a lot of our base needs met and stabilized first. So thank you. Shakur, I'd love to turn a question to you. Since you were a Miller case, it sounds like you weren't expecting to come home necessarily from your sentence. And then when Miller happened, I know a lot of juvenile lifers, it's like they woke up the next day and suddenly this chance of freedom occurred. We have a question from an attendee who wanted to know about reentry programs and agencies for juveniles. Were there any that helped you along the way or that you could speak to?
Yeah, so my turnaround was a bit unusual than most. After I got resentenced, after spending all that time in the department, oftentimes being refused services and programming just due to sentence structure, age, things such as that. When I got resentenced, I had a 55-day turnaround before discharge. So it was a really quick turnaround for me. I knew I probably wouldn't get parole just given the notification requirements for that and everything. Probably would not make it to work release just given the little bit of time that I had left. So for me, I think one of the things that was key for me was to remain hopeful my whole sentence. After I met few other men on the yard of the Nebraska State Penitentiary who were trying to work their way out of prison in a way never ever to return. It really gave me the hope that I needed at the time to begin to just reevaluate life, to know that it may one day be possible for me to get out as well. I think the one thing that needs to be understood about a prison sentence is that reentry needs to start from day one. If it ends up being that your reentry plan starts with you having 55 days left to discharge, you are already behind the proverbial 8 ball. So reentry is important, but not so much on the back end yet. That's the obvious part of it. But it's the front part of it that becomes ultimately more important. Building self-efficacy skills, building that sense of hope in a person, helping them to reevaluate usually their faulty thinking pattern to make better choices, better decisions, things that will lead to a different outcome than the one that sent them to prison. So for me, I think reentry has to be reevaluated along the entire continuum of incarceration, starting at the front. Because at some point, even a guy like me, destined never to get out of prison, I might get out.
Yes.
So how does society want me getting out? Do you want me getting out bitter, angry, or do you want me getting out better? So I think that all of the reentry programs should be offered to everybody that's there, because you never know when things are going to change. And the person that you thought that would never ever get out and be your neighbor or your son-in-law, they might very well get out. So the society, I think, has to be willing to invest in itself, to understand that if you look at other societies throughout the world that employ restorative justice practices, who get far better results than the United States is getting. Nationally, having a 76% recidivism rate. This speaks volumes to the quality of reentry at any level. In a 3-year period for 76 people to find themselves just as involved again on some level. I mean, I know of no business that could operate at a 76% loss and still be in existence. And these numbers shouldn't be accepted by the society. But again, a lot of this is politically driven. Politicians are elected. People need to understand the power of the vote. Politicians are elected. You need to vote your interest, and for people that are going to make sure that your interest is served. And reentry certainly is a part of that. Again, I would just say that, we look at the back end of it. Somebody's getting out. We need to provide housing and jobs and all these other. Okay, well, that's the obvious part. But if you never address the, I like to say that people oftentimes only want to look at the fruit, but not the root. Well, it is the root that ultimately grows the fruit. And you just can't look at the fruit and say, well, the fruit is rotten. It doesn't get that way overnight. So part of the issue, I think, with people recidivating, at least my experience of it has been, is that many people leave knowing that they are going to get out, which anybody that has a discharge number, that's ultimately going to take care of itself. Getting out is going to resolve itself. Staying out isn't. The staying out part is the part of the process that really needs to be addressed more just through cognitive programming, restorative education, things that get people to think in a different way. Just a quick story. There was an individual that before I was working at the Community Justice Center, I had a reentry job with reconnecting here in Omaha. There was a client there, just to kind of speed through this story. This is a guy who didn't really need any reentry services. He was financially pretty well off, him and his family. So he really didn't need a job, didn't need a house, didn't need a car. All of those resources were taken care of him that most people, you mentioned Maslow, all of those needs for him were taken care of. The one need that was not taken care of for him was his addiction. And his addiction ended up running the wheels off his car again, because that was the underlying root issue that he had never, ever addressed. So, reentry has to be geared towards an individual's need. It can't be cookie cutter. It can't be a one size fits all, because everybody's needs are going to be different.
Thank you. Thank you.
Can I make just a comment on what he's talking about with reentry?
Sure.
Those support services have, for somebody like Shakur is talking about, it's got to go for more than 6 months or 9 months or 10 months. They're taking a lifetime to build up some of their they have difficulty dealing with. And one of the things I like to talk about when I was running the jail is you need super case managed services. If people need help, they need that assistance. You can't do for them, but you have to be supportive. You have to make sure that there's structure in their lives. You have to make sure that Shakur is saying that they're dealing with some of those demons that maybe hadn't been adequately addressed while they were incarcerated. And if you don't provide those case managed services for a protracted period of time, then that person runs a higher risk of recidivating. And then you go back in front of the judge, and the judge says, well, obviously you didn't learn your lesson, so now I'm really going to put it on you. And then that just prolongs that individual stay in custody. So Shakur is right. Integrative reentry services are important, but that case managed services, once you start walking on your own, are very important to sustaining that success long term.
Thank you so much. Practically stole the words out of my mouth. I was going to say there's a tendency in the system to blame the individual if they return, as opposed to looking at the system. And one of my mentors always points to the babies in the river story, right? If all these babies start coming down the river, and so we can take babies out of the river and try to work with that. But ultimately, what we really need to do, to Senator McKinney's point, is to go upstream and see what's actually happening there. Attorney Riley, I'd love to toss the next question to you. One of our attendees on Facebook, Amanda, wants to know, how do we hold judges to the same fair standards in regards to sentencing?
Well, that's a great question. And it, honestly, it goes from the politics of state to state. As I said earlier, judges are appointed in Nebraska. They're appointed by the governor. And the governors, during my 40-something years here, whether they're Democrats or Republicans, have been very conservative / pro law enforcement / tough on crime. I guess the latter being the most important factor. If you did a examination of the backgrounds of the judges in district courts across the metropolitan areas of Nebraska, you'll find that a significant majority of them are former prosecutors. Now, in and of itself, that doesn't mean that they're necessarily bad judges, but the truth of the matter is that I find prosecutors by and large to be rather myopic. Defense lawyers think the world is gray. Prosecutors think the world is black and white. And as a result, if you're a judge that's a former prosecutor, when we go to a sentencing and try to explain to the court there are mitigating factors that should lessen the severity of the sentence, they have a proclivity toward listening to, quote, victims' impact statements and what the victims have to say. And that seems to trump everything. I could have all the science in the world in our favor, but if a victim comes in and is somewhat sympathetic or empathetic, and the judge, especially the judge who has dealt with, sorry about that, the judge who has dealt with dealing with victims and being sympathetic towards their side, it becomes a significant uphill battle. I'd add one more factor to it. When I first started, the probation office that did pre-sentence investigations was in Douglas County. It was run by Douglas County, and there were a significant number of African-American probation officers who lived in the North Omaha community who viewed probation as something to try to help people succeed. They didn't try to evaluate them and say, this person belongs in prison. They would tell the judge, here are the pros, here are the cons, and that they would present that information. And then when they were, if a client was placed on probation, especially a probationer who was in the North Omaha community and a probation officer who was also from the North Omaha community, many of times who were familiar with the families and friends of those folks, they tried to help them succeed and complete probation, and they helped them try to find jobs, helped them to find housing, helped them. I can't remember how many times Mark. I'm sure you remember Dora McDavis and Clay Parker and guys like that who, they maybe had a probationer who was not supposed to be drinking, and they'd be driving down 24th Street and see someone in one of the bars and go out, instead of call the prosecutor and say throw them in jail, they'd grab them by the back of the ear and bring them down to our office and say, hey, Tom, will you talk to them and say, you can't do this stuff or you're going to go to jail? I don't see the probation office. I hate to be too negative about it, but I don't see the probation office these days as being more interested in helping them succeed as opposed to helping catch them screwing up and saying, probation violation, go to jail. That's a progression that has occurred again over the last 40, 50 years. That's really sad. We're going backwards instead of forward.
Thank you, Attorney Riley. Senator, we had a question actually about gun legislation, and I apologize again, I was not here for what you spoke due to lightning literally striking, but one of our attendees wrote, I talked with a woman today who said that her 18-year-old son is getting caught up in a lot of trouble in the streets. He told her that he could go buy a gun for $50 anytime. Senator Chambers has described easy gun access in North Omaha as a long-standing problem, and he believes people outside the community are bringing guns in to sell. Can a panelist address this issue?
I mean, that definitely is an issue. It's tough. I've heard it, my whole life as well. I've heard stories of, people finding cases of guns or bags of guns just randomly in a community. I can't say if it's true or not, but I've heard multiple stories about this. The issue with the guns, it's I don't know, it's tough because I'm with y'all. I honestly don't know where to get the guns either. And considering the economics of the community, how are they able to afford guns in the first place? That's a whole nother conversation. But I don't know. It's tough. It's a hard issue to address through policy on a state level. I think it's something that's on a federal level because it's who's bringing the guns inside the community as well. I don't know. It's tough. I wish I had a better answer, but I think it's something to look at. But even with them, I think better gun education in the community as well. Not to say kids should have guns, but if you go to Western Nebraska, teenagers are utilizing guns on a daily basis and for hunting and things like that. So I think we got to reevaluate the relationship to guns to all communities in the state. More better gun education about how do you utilize a gun, no matter what, because we know that these teens or these kids are ending up with guns in their hand. Whether we agree or not, we should provide as many tools as possible to get them to know how to better handle a firearm and things like that. And because you could say ban all guns, but that's an uphill battle. Second Amendment rights. We live in the state of Nebraska. But I think the biggest thing, as I said prior, get these kids out of those situations in the first place where they even would remotely think about picking up a gun. So it's tough, but we also got to relook how we prosecute kids that get caught with guns too. I don't agree with it as well. I think the Omaha Police Department has a hand in that as well. They get these kids on these gun charges, and they get maxed out a lot of times. I was talking to somebody at the state penitentiary about that today. So it's a multifaceted, complex answer or situation. I don't think there's, from my perspective, as much from policy on a state level because I believe the guns are not they're surfacing in the community from outside states. So I think it's something we got to look at federally. Talk to Congressman Bacon about it, but.
Well, I think you really articulated actually what the point is, right? Is that prevention involves before a kid is even thinking about picking up a gun. And everybody on this panel so far has talked about prevention being a core part of this, right? And how we raise our children and the activities that our children are engaged in prior to becoming involved in any sort of high risk situations or any criminal activity, there's a whole host of things that parents in our country do to prevent anybody even going down that trajectory. And all of those things usually require resources, money, economics. But I'd love to stay on the gun thing for just a second and sort of shift it over to actually law enforcement, because Dr. Foxall, you ran a correctional facility, and law enforcement and correctional officers often have sort of same like politics or same, thought processes around how we handle people who are incarcerated. And one of our attendees asked, how can the Nebraska law enforcement associations be shifted from opposing every proposed reform to supported the needed reforms in the legislature? And I'd love to hear your perspective from a correctional officer standpoint.
Well, I think I'm going to give it to you from wear a lot of different hats. An academic hat, a corrections director hat, the federal agent hat, a police hat. So I'm going to give you kind of a blended response. Certainly, the Second Amendment is strong in our country, but that doesn't mean that we should not regulate the possession of firearms to some extent. And I think what gets people scared is people come out and say, well, they're going to ban all guns. Nobody's saying that, but some common sense regulation will certainly, I think, assist in what's going on in our communities today, here and elsewhere in the state. Certainly, the law enforcement, and law enforcement varies across the country too. You see certain law enforcement agencies come out strong for gun regulation. But then they also see the carnage on the street, and those law enforcement officers have to make those calls where they see young people shot dead, or innocent bystanders shot dead, and they're going to, if they can't get the gun regulation, then they're going to advocate someplace else. So then they're going to advocate for what? They're going to advocate for tougher gun laws. And again, you're behind the curve, right? And so I can't do anything about preventing guns from getting into the hands of the people that are willing to use it. But by God, maybe I can advocate for tougher sentencing. So they're going to follow that path. That's the path of least resistance, right? Because it follows with that get tough on crime, and then everybody jumps on that bandwagon. But then you talk about, well, let's try to prevent these guns from getting into the hands of people by some common sense regulation. Oh my God, no, we can't do that. It's the individual's right to carry his gun wherever he wants to and however he wants to. And that may be good when you're out in the desert someplace and you're all by yourself. But when you're in a city that's congested with a lot of people, you just can't walk around with your gun. And I think it's just irresponsible. One other thing I would say to that too is that the availability of guns comes as a result of a couple of different important ways. Straw purchasers, okay? You send somebody with what the kids call a square job, square driver's license, no criminal record. You send that poor unsuspecting person into the store, hey, Mr. X or Mrs. X, buy that gun for me because I'm a felon and I can't go. And they happily do it. It's a straw purchase, and then both of them get popped for a violation. And then they may adopt the case federally too. Certainly, county attorney takes a lot of those cases, and I know Tom sees them, but then the U.S. Attorney's Office takes a lot of them too on straw purchase, and the alcohol, tobacco, firearms, explosives are involved in that. But where a lot of those guns come from too is people do not protect the weapons that they rightfully possess. So they don't secure them at home. There's a burglary, gun's gone into the hands of somebody. They put their gun underneath the front seat of the car. Car's broken into, guns gone, guns in the hands of somebody that probably shouldn't have it. So a lot of those guns come from break-ins, whether it's a burglary of a residence or a break-in to a conveyance, a car, and then that's how they get out into the street. In addition to the straw purchasers, they're just not dropping out of the sky. Those guns are coming from someplace. Straw purchasers and break-ins. So we have to advocate for better gun safety. Okay, we just have to, and that's not just when you carry it on your person or you draw it in the face of a threat, but also when you're at home. Where are you securing that weapon? You just throwing it in the nightstand somewhere, stuffing it underneath your pillow? Well, that's not securing your weapon. And we've had too many incidents where little kids inside the residence get a hold of a gun, they shoot themselves because the weapon wasn't secured. Well, that's a whole nother problem.
Indeed.
Could I weigh on this for a second?
Absolutely. Go ahead.
I think Mark hits the nail on the head. You know, I'm a defense lawyer, and I represent people who are charged with unlawfully possessing weapons, et cetera, et cetera. And I will continue to do that with no problem. But that said, as a member of society, the firearms that are out there now, you don't have to be a good shot anymore. These semi-automatic and automatic weapons that are part of the drive-by shootings that I see frequently, they're just, it's like looking at the 1930s with the gangsters jumping out of the Model T with the Tommy guns and just blasting everybody. And whoever the hell gets in the way gets shot. You know, to tie this into the general topic of juveniles, think about that for a second. You know, they're told by someone that this guy is a target because he's in a rival gang and he lived at so-and-so street, and the 13, 14, 15-year-old kid, they give him the automatic weapon. They drive by the house. There's 5 or 6 people standing outside, and they spray the place with gunfire. Maybe they get the target that they wanted. Maybe they don't. Maybe they get the little kid in the house where the bullet goes through the window into the crib. So, you know, as much as I'm willing to defend anyone that's charged with crimes, I'm sick and tired, to be honest with you, of politicians who won't recognize that these weapons of war that are on the streets in Omaha and Chicago, in New York, in Baltimore, San Francisco, are just brutal weapons that cause unnecessary death and unnecessary incarceration by folks who aren't thinking about what they should be doing. So I'll get off my soapbox, but that's my point. Thanks for giving me a chance to spew.
Could I jump in here a minute?
Absolutely, please.
So I think what Dr. Foxall and what Tom is saying is absolutely right. But I think we have to connect the dots, because everything that we are talking about is really connected. Think about a lethal weapon of any kind being introduced in an already highly traumatized community. The result in that situation is probably going to end up on the 5 o'clock news, just because of all of the normal resources that may exist in another community: gun safety, gun education, education in other areas. People think differently. Just going back to Maslow's hierarchy of needs, that first step is your basic need to meet your survival. There's a reason why junior high school student would put 9mm in their lunchbox and not a peanut butter sandwich, because they are traumatized in the environment that they are in. And this is not to justify the act, but sometimes people react out of sheer survival, which seems abnormal to somebody that doesn't have to react to that same type of stimulus. So again, I think when you look at connecting the dots with the education and healthcare and mental health services and all of those things, being equal, yeah, you can have good results, but where they are not equal, nobody should ever expect the outcome to be ideal. It's just not going to happen. So, you know, and again, that is not to take the responsibility and the accountability off those that want to use the weapons. At some point, people have to rethink their conflict resolution. And many people haven't been taught how to resolve a conflict in any other way other than with some violence. So, that too is something that needs to be addressed. The old saying about guns not killing people, but people killing people is very true. A gun is not going to go off by itself. But with a mentality that may be lacking in many areas, then that gun is going to unfortunately go off one too many times.
Thank you so much, Shakur, for those thoughts. Everything that everyone has discussed tonight really is about this broad picture that people are a part of a context. Violence happens in a context. So when we're looking at treating, rehabilitation, transformation, we cannot just look to the individual when they are part of systems and families and communities. And real harm has been done, as Shakur has pointed out. It's not to remove responsibility, but it is to ask, what is the ultimate goal of justice? And as we bring this panel to a close, I just want to thank everyone for their input, we could really have this conversation for years, y'all. And I just want to remind everyone who is here attending on Facebook, who's watching, at the end of the day, the politics are where the power is at. If you believe in reform, if you believe that things need to change, call the people who represent you. Senator McKinney can tell you they listen to their constituents. And thank you so much. We will be having our next panel on Tuesday, August 10th. And I'd like to invite the attendees, if anyone wants to chime in with a final closing thought or statement, the floor is yours.
I just would add, and Tom knows this, crime in the United States has been dropping for years. Before the COVID, before this last spate of violence. In the 90s, crime has been dropping. I saw somebody up in Long Island. New York in the 90s was running a homicide rate of about 250 to 2,400 homicides a year, and they dropped down to about 450. Violent crimes are dropping all over the country for years, yet we still have these draconian penalties, and that really have disproportionate impacts on people in disenfranchised communities. So it's a little food for thought. Person crime, property crime has been dropping, but prison populations and enhanced penalties have been on the rise.
Absolutely. Thank you, Dr. Foxall. Anyone else want to chime in with our closing?
I would just say, again, thank you all for having me on this panel, but also to just say that, we all have to continue to be advocates for change within the criminal justice system, adult and juvenile, but we also have to be advocates to make sure that we're not just getting social changes, but we actually are getting resources to these communities where these individuals are coming from. If we get all the social change we want in the world and not improve the economic conditions in which these individuals are living in, we're going to be spinning our cycles. So definitely continue to always advocate for change within the criminal justice system, but we also have to be advocates of economic change in communities like North Omaha if we really want to see real results.
Thank you, Senator. Attorney Riley, Shakur?
The only thing I'd say is there's a lot of people on this panel that are a hell of a lot smarter than I am and know a lot more about the nuts and bolts of what's going on. All I can say is that I agree with pretty much what everyone has said. All this is nuanced. We can't look at things myopically and try to figure we're going to get a result, a favorable result by doing something singular. It's a big picture approach that has to be taken. And like I said, groups like this need to be expanded. People have to listen to what you have to say because this group knows what they're talking about. And so many of the as you said, Doctor, so many of these politicians are not necessarily intelligent. They're ignorant, not intentionally necessarily, but they're ignorant about what's going on. Because they won't listen to Terrell, they won't listen to Mark, they won't listen to Shakur, they won't listen to me, they won't listen to you, because they're worried about property taxes, or they're worried about some of the things. But this is, for us, this is the number one issue. And I think we just have to keep pushing forward. So as much as as Shakur knows, I'm a glass half empty person. The glass is half full.
Thank you, Shakur.
Yeah, like Tom said, thanks for having me. I just want to end by saying that, I think the punitive approach has to be one that has to be abandoned. It has been overused over the course of the last 40 years, have swelled the numbers to unprecedented numbers. This is the most incarcerated spot anywhere in existence. 2.3 million people incarcerated, another 6 to 7 million people on some form of supervised release, parole, probation, diversion. That model is not working. It is time for people, I think, to realize that there are alternatives such as restorative justice. There are plenty of other models around the world that are proving to be successful in addressing the same types of harms that exist here. I think it just takes political will to get to the point of trying something different. We can't build or sentence our way out of these problems without addressing the root causes, many of which have been addressed on this panel tonight.
Thank you so much. And you have actually brought up restorative justice several times. I have to plug, we'll be doing a restorative justice panel in October. So thank you, Shakur, an alternative to incarceration and one that's near and dear to my heart. Okay, everyone, as we close up, thank you again. Thank you. And let's continue the conversation. Goodbye, everyone.